In 1840, the British Empire was at war with China. The purpose of this war was to protect the British trade interests in China and to expand trade with the region. It's quite an interesting way to expand trade with the region by starting a war against it. But what's most interesting is that this war was named the First Opium War. Why the first, you may ask? Because there was also a second one. That's always the case when you get involved with empires. So let's see what happened there. So why are these wars called the Opium Wars? Certainly not because the soldiers were using illegal drugs. No, it's simply because Britain was very successful in trading opium in China. Imagine just a century and a half ago, Britain was transporting opium to China, selling it to the local population and making astronomical profits from it. And when China decided to restrict the spread of these goods, the empire decided to restore justice through the war. Let's rewind a bit and see what led to such intriguing trade relations between Britain and China. At the beginning of the 19th century, Chinese goods were in high demand in Europe, and their import was increasing. Considered a novelty and exotic, European buyers were willing to pay substantial sums for these goods. However, China saw little reason to import European products. The Chinese were interested only in furs and glass, the spheres where Britain wasn't particularly strong. Therefore, the trade balance between Britain and China was far from even, with the British having to cover the growing import from China with precious metals. Nevertheless, by 1820 the clever Brits found a way to improve their dealings with China. The East India Company, owned by the British, had a monopoly on purchasing opium in Bengal and sold this commodity to China, obviously not entirely legally. By 1830 the volume of opium sales to the Chinese had grown to 1,500 tons a year, and by 1833 the British had achieved a positive trade balance. This was nothing short of a wonder of the drugs trade. What did the Chinese do with such large quantities of opium, you may ask? Simply put, they smoked it. It all started with officials from the higher classes, then the trend spread to regional authorities and eventually to the army. By 1840, up to half of all Chinese officials and military personnel were smoking opium. In 1834, the East India Company lost its monopoly on the opium trade, and the revenues began to disperse among hundreds of merchants and trading companies. Gradually, the opium market in China began to close for the British, and the Chinese government started to raise alarms over the widespread drug addiction among its elite. At the same time, the British trade elite pressured their government to forcibly open the Chinese market. Relations between the Chinese and the British began to deteriorate significantly from 1834 onwards. There were even several military conflicts, but each was localized through mutual concessions. Nobody wanted a large-scale war. In 1839, the Chinese escalated the situation by forcing English trading companies to surrender their entire stock of opium for destruction. This audacity was unexpected by the British. They were expelled from Guangzhou, the only international port in China, and only those companies that signed a document renouncing opium import were allowed to trade there. The Chinese managed to significantly reduce opium smuggling, and these successes emboldened the emperor. In 1840, the emperor declared China a closed territory for all trading companies from Britain and India. This was the final blow to British pride and the catalyst for the military conflict. On the British side, about 3,000 British soldiers and over 1,000 members of the Indian Army participated in the war. China forces were impressive, up to 220,000 professional soldiers and more than 650,000 40,000 volunteers. However, the Chinese army was scattered throughout the country and had not been involved in combat for 35 years. All major military operations were conducted by the Navy. British warships approached Chinese army strongholds, bombarded them with their onboard guns, and then rapidly deployed landing parties for mop-up and capture operations. The Chinese were primarily killed by British artillery and their opium addiction, while the British primarily suffered from the hot climate and infections. The British quickly achieved success. Their appearance near Beijing compelled the emperor to agree to almost all of their terms. Trade with Britain was immediately resumed, and the British were also able to sell opium in Guangzhou again. However, the Chinese repeatedly reconsidered fulfilling the British demands and resumed hostilities. Each time, this resulted in devastating defeats for the poorly prepared Chinese troops. Eventually, the negotiators were forced to sign treaties with the British, the terms of which they concealed from the emperor to avoid his rage. This led to the complete loss of control by the Chinese authorities. By mid-1842, the British already controlled most of the major ports in southern China, including the port of Guangzhou, where they were fond of selling opium. The war concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Nanking aboard the British warship HMS Cornwallis. As a result of the war, the British gained the right to trade anything they wished in Chinese ports, received a payment from the Chinese equivalent to about $20 million in today's money, and as a bonus gained full control over the island of Hong Kong. For the British, the war ended in victory and the achievement of their economic objectives. However, China suffered significantly. The legalization of opium sales in China allowed other nations to enter this business. The flow of drugs through Chinese ports increased significantly. This led to a large portion of China's adult population becoming addicted to the devastating drug. The outcomes of the First Opium War continued to weaken and ravage China and its people for a long time.